Hello, I hope you're having a great day. Looking forward to sharing this Bible study with you today. God is blessing and we're thankful and just excited to see what God's going to do next. Title of our lesson today is entitled Trust Exhibited. Believers can trust God in all circumstances. And we're in Daniel chapter 6. We're going to look at verses 10 to 24. It's a very well-known passage of scripture that you learned as a child. It's about Daniel and his time in the lion's den. Now, there are events in our history that we never forget. When certain things happen, it gets etched into our minds. And it's that moment in time when everything seems to change. We refer to those events as defining moments. Let me share with you a few. There was a defining moment, October 24th, 1929. I don't expect all of y'all to remember that, but that was the day the stock market crashed and began the Great Depression. Now, I don't remember any of that. My parents remember the Great Depression because they were children during that time. But some of you may remember some of that, a part of it. I don't, but I've read about it. Now, do you remember what happened on November the 22nd, 1963? You probably do. That was the day that John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. And of course, we all remember December 7th, 1941. Not that I was alive during that time, and many of you probably weren't either, but we remember it because we've studied history. But most of us remember September the 11th, 2001, because that's etched in our minds because we remember it, because we lived through it. We remember significant dates like these because life is made up of a series of moments. Some good, some are bad. But some of those moments become defining moments. That is, moments that actually change the course of our history. Now, what about some biblical events, some moments in time? Just a few. Think about Noah when he decided to follow God's direction and build the ark. How about Abraham when he decided to follow God's direction and move to a new country? How about when Jesus called that fisherman named Peter to follow him? And at that moment, Peter said yes. And then there's the day, of course, we remember the day that changed all of our eternal destiny when Jesus went to the cross. But then there's that day when a man named Daniel made a very critical decision, became one of those defining moments. Now, if you know anything about Daniel, and I'm sure most of you do, you probably remember the story of his time in the lion's den. Now, the Babylonian Empire had come to an end, and the kingdom was divided between the Medes and the Persians. Now, Darius the Mede actually functioned as the king for this new Babylonian kingdom. He appointed 120 men. The Bible calls them satraps. They were just men who were to hold people accountable to keep the king from being defrauded, cheated. And then he appointed 3 administrators over those 120 to work directly under him. And now one of those 3 was Daniel. In fact, Daniel was such a good and capable worker that the king put him in charge of all of them. Now, sometimes the leader is not particularly liked by everyone under him. And so those who were not happy with Daniel went to work to try to find something that Daniel was doing so they could tattle on him and bring him down. You know, there was probably some jealousy. Some of those men probably thought they should get that position that Daniel had. But Daniel was different. And they couldn't find any dirt on him. So what could they do? Well, they tried to create dirt. Some of the 122, the 120 plus the other two administrators, went to the king and said, we voted, and we believe that you, the king, should write an executive order and establish a law that for 30 days, anyone who would pray to any god or any man other than the king, that individual should be thrown into the lion's den. So the king, he went ahead with it and did what they asked. He signed an executive order into law. And when he signed it, it became law. Now, there are times when we all will be faced with difficult decisions. The decisions that we have to make are, have the potential to change our future for the better or for the worse. But there's only one person that can make that decision. Who do you think it is? It's you. No one else can make that decision for you. But the greatest decision that you will ever make is to continue to put your faith and trust in God and His Son, Jesus Christ, even when your world is completely falling apart. Daniel learned about this particular executive order that became a law, but he kept praying to his God 3 times a day. And he'd been doing that all along, so he didn't stop. His accusers saw him praying to God and ratted him out to the king. Now, they said that Daniel had disobeyed the king's law. And the king was displeased when he heard about this, but he started looking for some way out, some way to rescue Daniel. But he couldn't find anything. Now, as the king's order, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. The king couldn't sleep that night. So he hurried to the lion's den the next morning and he called out, hoping that Daniel would call back to him. And Daniel answered him and told him that God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. And the king was excited about that and ordered Daniel to be brought out of the lion's den. And then he ordered the accusers and their families to be thrown into the den with the lions, and they all died there. So Darius the king sent the word out through the whole land, through the kingdom, that people should honor Daniel's God because he was able to do an incredible thing, including saving Daniel from the lions. And after his deliverance, Daniel continues serving the king. Now, we're going to read verse 10 and 11 and see how they set this trap. It says, when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in the upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So Daniel's peers, they wanted to take him down. But because of his integrity, they knew that Daniel's faith was probably the only way to drive a wedge between him and the king. So they devised a plan on how to do just exactly that. So Daniel learned about the executive order, the document that the king had signed. This tells us that he probably wasn't present when the other officials persuaded the king to sign an edict, a law, an executive order. He knew that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, this edict could not be changed. Consequently, he must have figured death would be awaiting him because he knew what he was going to do. He went to his house, but he didn't go to hide, but he had already determined how he was going to respond, what he was going to do. He would stay faithful to his God, no matter what it cost him. Daniel's house had an upstairs room, and that probably indicates to us his status, to have a room with an upstairs. And that upstairs room was a place where he could rest without being disturbed. It usually had lattice windows so that it would allow the breeze to come through to circulate the air. And apparently Daniel used his upstairs room as a prayer room. Now the windows in this upstairs room open toward Jerusalem. And Daniel's practice of praying towards Jerusalem followed Solomon's prayer from centuries earlier. You see, in 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon made a speech, and he mentioned several times to turn toward the temple to pray. So Daniel was following Solomon's instructions. And even today, many Jewish people, they choose to face Jerusalem when they pray. Now, praying on his knees provided a visible expression of his desire that one day, God's people would return home to Jerusalem and establish a new life there. So Daniel's custom was to go before the Lord 3 times a day, and he would get down on his knees and pray. Praying on your knees signifies a posture of humility, and Daniel was recognizing his place before God. The text also reveals that Daniel's prayer posture and his routine was just like it had been before. It was something he consistently did. He refused to allow the king's decree to change his practice. And Daniel's accusers went as a group and probably did that to have many witnesses in order to bring charges against Daniel. And they found him praying to his God just like they thought they would. Now, we tend to think of Daniel as a young man at that time. But the historical setting suggests that he was much older. He was probably around a 15-year-old teenager when he was taken captive in 605 BC. And the events of Daniel chapter 6 probably happened a couple of years after the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. So Daniel would probably have been in his 80s when he was thrown into the lion's den. Now, verses 12 and 14 follows. It says, so they approached the king, that meaning those officials that caught him praying. They approached the king and asked about the edict, the executive order. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person petitioning any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, king, and the edict that you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very disappointed, and he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Now, Daniel's enemies, they approached the king and asked about the edict, although they already knew what it said, but they wanted to have the king verify it by his own lips before they told the king about Daniel's situation. These accusers were very clever. They said, didn't you sign an edict? That was the first part of the question. Then they spelled out the terms. The executive order was supposed to last 30 days, and it applied to any person who was caught praying to any god or man except Darius the king. And then the guilty party would be thrown into the lion's den. So the king his reply was probably better than they could have hoped. The king verified that as the law of the Medes and Persians, that order stands and is irrevocable. Persian law was unchangeable once the king signed it into law. The Persians did that to ensure that the king or the leader didn't play favorites or apply the law arbitrarily. So in Daniel chapter 6, Darius, the king, his pride led him to issue a decree that would trap one of his most loyal servants, who was Daniel. So Daniel's accusers identified Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, as the guilty party who broke the king's law. They testified that they had witnessed him praying 3 times a day. And as soon as the king heard this, he was displeased. He recognized the mistake of being led by his own pride to enact such a law as this. He had carelessly trapped one of his most trusted officials, and now he had to hand him over to be executed. He immediately set his mind on rescuing Daniel. I can see his mind. I am going to find some way to get Daniel out of this. As king, he had a lot of resources at his disposal, but he couldn't find any way out of this law. And the king worked hard until sundown to find a solution, but he had no luck. Scholars assume that the law required that the sentence be carried out by sunset. That's why he worked till sundown. And as believers, we must be ready for a time when God calls us to stand alone for him as others try to limit our worship of him. We live in a country where persecution for our faith is pretty subtle. But how long will that continue? The Bible is clear that our absolute allegiance must belong to the Lord. He must have first place in our lives above everything else. We need to ask God to give us the grace to stand faithfully for him in the face of challenges. Now, verses 15 to 18 says, "Then these men went together to the king and said to him, 'You know, your majesty, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed.' So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you.' And then a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep." Now notice how throughout the chapter of Daniel chapter 6, the accusers acted as if their concern was for the king's honor. But what they really wanted from the very beginning was to trap Daniel and get rid of him. These officials reminded the king of his executive order that it actually constituted a law of the Medes and Persians. It was law. And to top that off, they added the detail that no ordinance the king established can be changed. They had trapped the king with his own decree to get rid of Daniel. And at that point, Darius the king figured out the malicious intent of these officials, but the decree was irrevocable. Now you may wonder why Daniel wasn't thrown into a fiery furnace like his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Unlike the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians worshipped fire as a part of their Zoroastrian belief. So they would not have used fire as capital punishment. Instead, they used mutilation by lions as a means of execution. So the king gave the order. It was an order he didn't want to give, but he had to. He didn't want to condemn to death his most trusted official, but Persian law gave him no choice. They brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den, an action that meant certain death. Now, before the soldiers threw Daniel into the den, the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." The king's words could be read as an affirmation of belief that God would deliver Daniel. But the text indicates King Darius believed also that he was sending Daniel to his death. Daniel's death seemed to be literally sealed. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and it was sealed to prevent any possibility of Daniel escaping. The word for den also means pit. That suggests that it probably was just a big hole in the ground with a fence around it. And scholars believe that chains held the stone in place over the entrance. And then soft clay tablets were attached to that chain. And the king and his nobles made their personal mark or their seal by pressing their ring into the clay. Now, once the clay hardened, no one could remove the chains without breaking the seal. The appearance of the king's seal on this stone made anyone who saw it, made them aware that this was official business of the royal court. And the king, after he did that, went to his palace and spent the night fasting. His fasting could have been an act of religion, but more than likely, he just refused to eat when he knew that his friend and trusted official was facing lions. He refused any diversions. And in light of the circumstances, he couldn't sleep. So Darius wanted no distractions. Nothing could console him. You see, Jesus' death on the cross is a great example of the fact that God is always with us. Jesus was fulfilling God's plan perfectly, but he seemed to be alone and rejected. The night before Jesus went to the cross, Jesus told his followers that they were going to face persecution in this world. But then he told them, in John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." Daniel 6:19 and 20 to 23, it says, "At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. 'Daniel, servant of the living God,' the king said, 'has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?' And then Daniel spoke with the king. 'May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm.' The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. Then, when Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. At the first light of dawn, the king got up. He must have tossed and turned all night long and couldn't sleep. So he hurried to the lion's den, and he was probably pretty certain what he was going to find when he got there, unless there was a miracle. Could Daniel's God have overcome this foolish executive order, law? As the king reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. The words translated cried out in anguish emphasized the king's despair. He had no reasonable expectation that Daniel was going to still be alive. In fact, the words translated to Daniel, he cried out to Daniel, could also be translated, he cried out for Daniel. That is, the king may have been sorry for his decision to throw his trusted friend to the lions. We don't know for sure, but the king's referring to Daniel as servant of the living God implies that the king had a little bit of faith. Scholars believe it was borrowed faith. Evidently, he had come to recognize Daniel's faith and his loyalty to God. And maybe he thought that if anyone could deliver Daniel, it was Daniel's God. The king's question, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? That implied exactly that the king recognized Daniel's faithfulness to his God. As was custom, Daniel shifted the attention from himself to the Lord. He had done this before. In fact, he did it 3 times. First of all, he credited the Lord with revealing and interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream earlier. Secondly, he credited God's role as he interpreted the handwriting on the wall for King Belshazzar. And then third, here, he does it again. He said, my God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. Daniel said the reason God protected him from the lions, he said, I was found innocent before him. God glorified himself by protecting Daniel from death. Now, Daniel's words, also, before you, your majesty, I have not done you harm. He assured the king that he had continued to be faithful to the Persian king that he served. And the king was overjoyed to hear Daniel's voice and to realize that Daniel's God had delivered him despite the king's foolishness. Darius the king gave orders to get Daniel out. And Daniel was brought up from that den and he was found to be unharmed. This is a statement that parallels what was said when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fiery furnace. They didn't even smell like smoke. The fire had no effect on them, and the lions had no effect on Daniel. The text reminds us of the reason for Daniel's deliverance. He trusted in his God. His 3 friends had trusted God as well, even to the point of risking their own lives. Then years later, God demonstrated his ability to save Daniel also. In the book of Hebrew, in chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, the last 5 verses, verse 35 to 40, it reminds us that God doesn't deliver all of us from harm or death, but all through history, God has chosen to rescue his people dramatically, as he did with Daniel and his 3 friends. But other believers glorified God through their death. We have the assurance that God is always providing grace for his people regardless of the outcome. God vindicates faithful believers one way or another for his honor. Daniel chapter 6, verse 24. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought before and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives were thrown into the den. They had not even reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. The king then gave the command to execute those men who had maliciously accused Daniel. The king had just witnessed an amazing feat of divine intervention. The king ordered the accusers thrown into the lion's den, and that judgment included the accusers, their children, and their wives. The account of Daniel in the lion's den reminds us that we can trust God in all circumstances. Sometimes we may even face persecution that challenges our faith, but we must remember we can trust God, and we know that He knows our situation, and He will act to bring honor to Himself as we stay faithful to Him. Then on top of that, our faithfulness to Him in the face of difficult circumstances is a witness to unbelievers around us. Trust and prayer characterized the life of George Mueller. He was a 19th century German evangelist, humanitarian. He spent 73 of his 92 years walking in close fellowship with God. George Mueller's father wanted him to earn a comfortable living as a clergyman for the state church. But George didn't live a very Christian life as a teenager and young adult. But one day he was invited by a friend to his home to a meeting where prayer was a major emphasis. And he was touched deeply by God in that meeting. His life was changed. He told a friend that all of his former pleasures paled in comparison to that evening when God began a work of grace in his life. Mueller's life dramatically changed. George Mueller prayed about everything and expected God to answer every prayer. And as a result, his challenges produced a deeper faith and trust in God. George Mueller moved to England in 1832, where he and his wife opened an orphanage that would become their primary life's work. Psalm 81, verse 10, the second half of that verse became his life verse. And it says, "Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it with good things." He applied this verse to the orphanage ministry, and he never asked anyone but God to meet the needs of the orphans. At the end of his life, records reveal that George Mueller's orphanage cared for over 10,000 orphan children. And God always supplied every resource for the work, whether it be food, clothing, medical care, education, everything the children needed, God supplied in response to George Mueller's prayer. George Mueller learned that he could trust God in all circumstances, and so can we. Let me pray. Father, let us apply this to our lives and take a stand and continue to stand for God, no matter what's going on around us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you. God bless y'all. Hope you have a great day.